This is the final talk in our series, Heresies, Ancient and Modern. So far, we've looked at the prosperity gospel and the ancient heresies of Marcionism and Gnosticism. And this morning, I've been tasked with exploring the modern heresy that Christianity equals being nice. I was initially quite daunted by the title for this talk. Heresy sounds like quite a weighty and complex topic, and at that point, I wouldn't have had the first clue about how to define either Marcionism or Gnosticism. I'm not sure I'd even have been able to spell them. But I'm pleased to say that that's no longer the case after listening to the earlier talks in this series. I was also relieved to discover that heresy wasn't nearly as complicated as I had feared. As we've seen in the earlier talks in this series, heresy begins with a truth that is gradually distorted into a lie. We look to the Bible for answers to questions about God and faith and what Christians should be like. The Bible is an ancient text written in another time and culture and context, so it requires interpretation, something that I know has been explored in great detail at Sunday School for Grown-ups on Sunday evenings. A good interpretation of the Bible points us towards God, helping us to make sense of God and the world and our place in it. A bad or incorrect interpretation of a biblical truth twists it, maybe just a tiny amount, but the result is that it no longer points us towards God, but leads us in a slightly different direction, and potentially way off course, depending on how far the trajectory is able to continue. So what we need to do this morning then is work out whether or not the Bible tells us to be nice. Does Christianity, becoming as Christ-like as possible, equal being nice? Earlier in the year, Stephen encouraged me to read this book, Nice: Why We Love to Be Liked and How God Calls Us to Be More, by Sharon Hodder Miller. Now that I've finished it, I suspect he may have done this just to mess with me, knowing that I would find it quite a confronting read. I started it, but I put it down after the first few chapters, only returning to it when I needed to start preparing for this talk. In a nutshell, this book argues that society in general, and Christianity in particular, have developed into a culture that prizes niceness above other, more important things. Of course, in all sorts of situations, it's nice to be nice. The book doesn't dispute that. Its central argument, though, is that it's all too easy for Christians to hide behind being nice when we should, in fact, be something more. That, consciously or otherwise, we end up using niceness as a tool to avoid putting ourselves in uncomfortable but Christ-like situations, or worse, to manipulate a person or an outcome in a way that will benefit us. I think that this is why I initially resisted reading the book. I didn't want to have to grapple with whatever might be lurking beneath the sparkly surface of niceness, because, well, I'm nice. It's a bit awkward for me to say that out loud because nice people don't go on about their niceness. But reading this book and writing this talk have forced me to recognize that being nice is actually quite a big part of my personality. I've become good at it. I have a personality type that seeks to avoid confrontation at all costs and craves validation from other people. My sense of worth is, to a large extent, derived from how useful or necessary I feel like I am in the eyes of the people around me. When I'm at my best, I'm easygoing, I'm helpful, I'm agreeable, I'm reliable, I'm kind, I'm friendly, I'm a nice person. And I know that there are lots of other nice people here this morning too. It's sort of hardwired into a lot of us. Most of us will have been brought up by parents, grandparents, teachers, all encouraging us to be nice or telling us off for doing something that's not nice. I think this is particularly true for women. I suspect that many women here today would list nice pretty high up on a list of things that society, or even we ourselves, think that we should be. We live in a culture where, at least until fairly recently, there's been a sense in which boys will be boys, but girls must be nice, must be kind and gentle, not too loud, not too boisterous, not too physical, mustn't rock the boat, mustn't be an inconvenience. Men and women have been and continue to be held to different standards. Men will be described as having great leadership skills, while a woman behaving exactly the same way might be described as bossy or controlling or ambitious. A man who speaks his mind is strong and passionate, while a woman who speaks her mind might be called shrill or emotional. Men will be described as assertive or authoritative, when a woman might be thought of as pushy or harsh or even cruel. A man who thinks outside the box might be considered visionary, when a woman with the exact same idea might be considered naive. To an extent, we are all, women and men, expected to be nice. But when we behave in a way that lands outside the bounds of niceness, women tend to be judged far more harshly than men are. But, feminism aside, does Christianity equal being nice? On the surface, niceness seems entirely positive. Niceness is not just a socially acceptable behaviour, but an openly encouraged one. In her book, though, Sharon Hodder Miller argues that niceness has a flip side which isn't actually all that pleasant. She highlights two reasons for this. And the first is that niceness gets you things. She writes, "The rewards are many for being nice. It earned me a lot of attention and positive affirmation, and because of this, it wasn't long before my motives for being nice became extremely muddled." I think, to a greater or lesser extent, we have all known this to be the case. Whether or not it has been the motivating factor, the truth is, if we are nice, people will like us. And if people like us, we're welcomed into the fold. We're connected and protected. We're affirmed and perhaps even admired. We feel wanted and needed. We feel like we belong. Niceness greases the wheels of social interactions. It opens doors. It helps us to maneuver our desired outcomes at work, at the school gate, at the customer service desk. In our friendships or at home, niceness tempts us to tell white lies or withhold the truth for the sake of preserving relationships. More than that, people will forgive all manner of failures in someone they think of as being nice. I'm sure we've all come across examples of journalists interviewing shocked neighbours after an awful scandal has come to light, who have said, "I can't believe it. They were just so nice." If we serve niceness, it will usually serve us well in return. All of this isn't to say that we shouldn't be nice. It's that we should aim to be more than that. Jesus set the bar very high when it comes to the way that we should treat the people around us. During the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbour and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that?" Being nice is perhaps a good start, but Jesus points out here that pretty much everyone is nice. Everyone loves the people who love them back. Everyone is happy to do a favour for a friend. Everyone is happy to step up when someone they care about needs a helping hand. How good are we at loving our enemies, though? How likely are we to go above and beyond for somebody that we don't actually like very much? For someone that we find irritating or demanding or unreasonable? How many times will we go out of our way for someone who never says thank you? for someone who we know would never return the favor. As far as Jesus is concerned, niceness isn't enough. As Christians, we are called to live out a radical love, a love that just doesn't quite make sense in the eyes of those who witness it. Jesus taught us to turn the other cheek and to go the extra mile, because when we are prepared to live like that, God can use these acts of love to punch far above their weight. Just a few verses earlier, Jesus says, "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Acts of unexpected kindness, however small, can point people towards God. So, that's the first reason that Christianity doesn't equal being nice. Because being nice actually sets the bar far too low. Niceness is very often its own reward, and that can muddle our motivation. Christianity holds us to a higher standard in the ways that we seek to interact with the people that God has placed around us. Why settle for being nice when we could be so much more? The second reason Sharon Hodder Miller identifies is actually a much darker and more dangerous one. She suggests that many Christians have turned niceness into an idol. An idol, in this sense, is a bit like a heresy. As we saw earlier, heresy takes something that is true, that is supposed to point us towards God, and distorts it slightly into something that ultimately ends up pointing us away from God. And idols can be thought about in the same way. An idol can be made of something that starts out entirely positive, something God-given even, but it becomes twisted and distorted somewhere along the way so that we end up valuing it more highly than we value God. Our priorities shift. So how then can niceness become an idol? Well, very often doing the nice thing and doing the Christ-like or Christian thing are one and the same. Or sometimes they overlap. But when they're not, or when they don't, which one will we choose? Are we more concerned about being seen as nice or as Christ-like? If I'm honest, I've been the friend that has told someone what they want to hear, rather than risking telling the truth. I've been the person who has allowed, or even quietly helped, someone to justify a decision that was ultimately selfish or unethical, rather than encouraging them to make a better choice. I've been the person who has deliberately looked the other way or turned a blind eye in order to avoid confrontation. I've kept quiet during conversations or discussions around controversial topics for fear of being seen as judgmental, of alienating someone, or even worse, alienating myself. When it's been impossible to be both, I have often chosen to be nice instead of choosing to be Christ-like. And I suspect I'm not alone in that. Barry Corey, in his book Love Kindness, Discover the Power of a Forgotten Christian Virtue, writes, "Niceness may be pleasant, but it lacks conviction. It has no soul. Niceness trims its sails to prevailing cultural winds and wanders aimlessly, standing for nothing and thereby falling for everything. Niceness is cosmetic. It's bland." By this definition, niceness is the complete opposite of what Christianity is all about. In Matthew 5, as part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus explicitly warns us against being bland. He said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." The world doesn't need people who are blandly nice. The world needs people who are willing to dare to be more. Jesus modeled how to do this. He was a man who held firmly to his convictions. When societal norms were not in alignment with God's kingdom values, he was unapologetically countercultural. Jesus lived a life filled with purpose and direction. Nothing about him was cosmetic. He was totally authentic in every aspect of life and relationship. And far from being bland, he was at times pretty spicy. Sharon Hodder Miller puts it like this: following Jesus means following a man who spoke hard and confusing truths, who was honest with his disciples, even when it hurt, who condemned the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and turned over tables in the temple. Jesus was a man who went face to face with the devil himself and died on a cross rather than succumb to the status quo. Jesus was loving, he was gracious, he was forgiving, he was kind, but he was not simply nice. He was a man who would leave the 99 sheep to rescue the one, but he was also totally unafraid of offending people. Jesus understood the difference between graciousness and personal compromise, between speaking the truth and needlessly alienating people. Rather than wear a shiny veneer, he became the embodiment of rugged love. This, not niceness, is what we are called to. This is what we should be aiming for. But that can be hard, really hard. Firstly, because society does not always respond well to people who don't follow the rules of niceness, who stray outside the boundaries of being pleasant or encouraging to say something that is timely or true, however gently and compassionately it is done. But secondly, it can be hard because niceness is so very subjective. What is meant as a gentle challenge can be received as harsh and judgmental, doing harm to both the person and the relationship. But, on the other hand, wrapping up a hard truth in too much grace and kindness can lead to the other person missing the challenge entirely. In Galatians 5, Paul describes what it looks like to be a Christian. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbour as yourself. He goes on to explain what this looks like in practice, setting out two lists as examples: the fruit of the Spirit and the acts of the flesh. Only one of these lists is memorized by children in Sunday school, and for good reason. But hidden in amongst some of the more extreme vices on the list of the acts of the flesh are some behaviours that we are probably guilty of more often than we would like to admit: hatred, discord, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy. We are not called to be nice, but we are certainly not called to be the opposite of nice. Our motivation matters as much as our actions do. Paul says that the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. Our spirit, the Christ-like part of ourselves, and our flesh, the part of ourselves that is rooted in our culture, are in conflict with one another. And part of being a Christian is drilling down into these moments of internal conflict to see what's at the root of them. Are we being motivated by love or by selfish ambition? Just because something is true, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are the right person to say it. If there is a part of us that will get some pleasure out of putting someone in their place or seeing someone on the back foot, we're not humbly serving them in love. If we are aware that saying or doing something to challenge the status quo will bring about a result that is personally convenient to us, can we be sure that we are not acting out of selfish ambition? If we're going to disclose something about someone that will damage their reputation in some way, can we do this in a way that is purely motivated by goodness, or are we seeking to spread discord or create division? Do we derive a sense of power or importance from being seen as a truth teller or a whistleblower? It's possible to do the right thing that God can use to bring about the right outcome, but to act without integrity. Paul tells us how Christians should be characterized. The fruit of the Spirit is the natural outcome of the Holy Spirit's presence in our lives. It's not a list that we can pick and choose from depending on the circumstance or the convenience at any given moment. These are supposed to be the qualities that radiate from us when we are earnestly living out our faith. These qualities are how the reality of God's love is displayed through us to the people around us. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. We should never deliberately not be any of the things on this list. We can tell someone a painful truth while still being loving, gentle, and kind. We can express righteous anger and indignation while simultaneously exercising patience and self-control. We can challenge the status quo while ultimately aiming for peace rather than just winning whatever the cost. We can criticize while still being faithful rather than disloyal. So, where does this leave us? Is there such a thing as a nice Christian? Are we forced to choose between being one or the other? We've seen that while niceness isn't inherently wrong, it can become problematic when we elevate it above our call to be Christ-like. Being nice might make our lives easier and win us friends, but Jesus calls us to something far more challenging and meaningful. The question isn't whether we should stop being nice. It's whether we are willing to be more than nice when that's what following Jesus requires. Are we prepared to speak difficult truths with love? To stand firm in our convictions while showing grace? To choose what's right over what's comfortable? Jesus didn't come to teach us how to be nice. His radical love and unwavering truth-telling challenged the systems and attitudes of his day. He showed us that true love, the kind of love we're called to embody, sometimes means being willing to be misunderstood, rejected, or labeled as difficult for the sake of God's kingdom. The challenge for us today is to examine our own hearts. Where have we been settling for niceness when God is calling us to something more? Where have we chosen comfortable silence over speaking the truth in love? Where have we hidden behind pleasantness rather than demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit in all its fullness? Let's pray for the wisdom to discern when being Christ-like requires more than being nice, and for the courage to choose faithful obedience over social acceptance. May we be known not just for our niceness, but for our authentic Christ-like love, a love that transforms lives and points others to God.